the way that she does this is through her signature framework, the Power Partners formula. Mallory provides unique tools to help nonprofit fundraisers get more from foundations, corporate partners, and individuals. She's coached over 1,000 fundraisers and using her unique win-win framework. When she's not coaching others to be their best fundraising selves, Mallory is hosting the What's the Fundraising podcast, where she invites impact leaders and chats with experts in personal and professional development, helping them transform the way they raise money, lead organizations, and change the world. And today, you are going to just fall in love with what she is going to talk about. It's going to be magnetic. So Mallory, I'm going to hand it off to you and take it away.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for that really warm welcome. Thank you to the whole Memory Fox team for having me today. I'm so excited to have the opportunity to dive into magnetic storytelling with all of you, how to tell the right story to the right audience. And you already heard a lot about me, but these are sort of the different ways you can connect with me. And I'll show some of this at the end as well. But I wanted to start actually with a story. So for those of you who aren't familiar with my work, and you can tell me in the chat if this is you too, but I became an accidental fundraiser when I started to get promoted up through nonprofits, first in a managing director role and then an executive director role that came with big fundraising responsibilities. And I would love to know, for the folks who are here, if any of you identify as an accidental fundraiser as well, or maybe an accidental marketer, if this is you. And because when I started this role, I had a vision about what this was going to mean for me. I thought I was going to have consistent fundraising success. I was going to be this empowered and confident leader. I was never going to work more than 40 hours a week. I was going to be having donors come to me. But the reality is that it was a complete hustle. And as I was running this nonprofit, I show this picture a lot, but as I was running my nonprofit, I was putting on this appearance everywhere, like I had it all together. But the reality is that every day was a constant hustle. I was so burnt out and overwhelmed all the time. And I got to a real breaking point where I thought about leaving the nonprofit sector. But instead, I gave up my current position, which actually meant that I switched organizations, assuming it would be different somewhere else. And actually, at first, it was a little bit different somewhere else because it was new and I was able to find this new flow and had a new boss. But then before I knew it, I started getting right back into that same hustle. And I remember, I ended up prioritizing my organization instead of my family, my friends. I ended up developing chronic pain. And I was sitting at work one day, just clicking refresh, literally on my email, waiting for one of 50 donors to actually email me back, when I had this moment where I said, a year from now, I cannot be doing this anymore. I either want a thriving nonprofit where fundraising is easier, less stressful, and doesn't make me feel so cringy all the time, or I'm going to leave the nonprofit sector. And I knew I really didn't want to leave the nonprofit sector. So I needed to create a reliable fundraising method with the tiny bit of time that I could sacrifice. And so I'll be honest, right when I thought about this, my self-critic went wild. I thought about every reason why I couldn't do it. I mean, I was literally barely hanging on as it was. I'd already been working so much and not been able to figure it out. So how on earth could I actually build an effective fundraising engine and the right prospect pipeline with a few hours a week? There was no way. But the moment I feel like something is close to impossible, a fire inside me is really lit. And I think nonprofit leaders, you can relate to this because this is true for you too, right? We're we have to figure this out. So I went down this research rabbit hole for 3 months, testing every different fundraising strategy you could think of and iterating on the old school ways we've been taught to fundraise. With what I learned in getting executive coach certified, trained in habit and behavior design, and it all finally clicked. And I was able to combine the science and the art of fundraising. I ended up getting 7 donor meetings secured in 1 week. It was an 87% return rate on my email outreach, which then led to more than $450,000 in funding. And that is how the Power Partners method was born. So this method, everything I'm teaching you from today is from inside this method. This is is how I teach fundraisers and marketers to stop the hounding hamster wheel and build the right funding partnerships to feel confident and prepared talking to any donor. And this is what made me finally feel that wave of relief that every year wasn't going to be a mad, uncomfortable dash to reach my budget goals. So that's a little bit about me. But why did I just tell you my story? So the reason I wanted to start this webinar today with actually walking through what I'm going to be teaching you today is because storytelling does a few really critical things. It gives context. Why am I here? Why are you on this webinar? Why are you listening to me right now? Maybe for some of you, it also elicited some emotion. You were like, oh, I recognize that, or oh, I felt that way before. Or maybe you were just like, oh, I feel really sorry for her that was her experience. And it builds connection. It builds familiarity. It builds trust, right? Some of you maybe saw yourself in my story and you thought, oh, she knows what I go through. She knows what this is like for me, right? So I used my story to start our time together for all of these reasons. And I'm going to show you how I did that and what the arc of my story was. And I'm going to teach you how to do this for your nonprofit, for you, for any stories that you want to tell inside your organization. Okay, so there were some pillars, there were some storytelling pillars inside my story, and we're going to walk through this in detail. So don't worry if you don't catch it right away. We're going to go through every single one. But there was this exposition and character development. I set the stage for the story. I gave you a conflict, a core problem, the underlying problem. I thought fundraising was going to be like this, but it actually was like this. Then I gave a rising action and challenges, right? And solutions. I tried this thing, and then I tried this thing, and then I tried this thing. And I got to this moment where I couldn't do this anymore. I got to a climax, a pinnacle moment. And then I told you about how I resolved that pinnacle moment, right? I was clicking refresh on those emails. A year from now, I could not be doing this anymore. That was a climax, pinnacle moment. And then I resolved it by showing you what I did, what I learned, how I shifted my fundraising that ultimately resolved, okay? And then if I wanted you to invite you to join Power Partners, that could have been my call to action right there at the end. But I was using my story as a way to show you how this framework actually builds connection and relationship really quickly. One of the things I hear from fundraisers and marketers, all nonprofit leaders a lot, is the way they feel like they can trust me really fast. And I think a big part of that is because of how I use storytelling and how I use my own story to connect and to relate to fundraisers, because my story is like so many of yours, okay? So now I'm going to teach you how to create your magnetic impact story. Okay, that's what we're going to be walking into right now. And I don't know if anything is not on mute. I'm getting a little bit of background noise, so maybe we want to make sure folks are muted, but maybe that's just me also. So if it is, that's okay. Okay. So before we dive into teaching you how to build your magnetic impact story, I just want to tell you what I mean by impact story first and foremost. So an impact story uses narrative to make an emotional connection between your audience and the incredible work that you do. So good impact stories actually create a real connection by following what's called a dramatic arch. Okay, there's those 5 pillars. We're going to talk about this a lot more. And what happens when our brain goes through a dramatic arch is that it actually changes our brain chemistry by producing 2 chemicals. So cortisol, which focuses our attention on something. It actually creates a little bit of distress in us, right? But we like narrow in, we focus on it. And oxytocin, which is responsible for care, connection, and empathy. And there have been a lot of studies done that actually show that the amount that donors give can be linked to the amount of oxytocin actually released in their brain. So this is like science-backed storytelling that we are walking into right now, okay? So magnetic storytelling is about connection. It's about connecting to the brains and hearts and bodies of the people that you're talking to. And the dramatic arc and the release of those hormones inside your brain, that is what makes us feel connected, okay? So again, these are the 5 principles, the 5 pillars of an impact story that I talked through with you today. And I want to explain something really quick before we start to walk into these in more detail. The thing I want to tell you is I'm going to teach you this framework today that can be used with telling all different types of stories. So sometimes I'll use an example that's either like an individual's story who went through the services in your organization, or maybe the story is the founding of the organization, or perhaps the story is your story and what brought you to the organization. Either way, what I want you to understand is that this framework can lay on top of any story and should lay on top of any story that you want to tell. Anytime you are looking to truly connect with your donors, with your community members, with your staff, with your board members, this arc can be used to build that connection. Okay. So this is one example of those 5 pillars, right? Starting with exposition and character development, maybe you're giving an individual example inside your organization. The core issue, the conflict, the core problem is the core issue in society that either the individual is having to face, or perhaps that the organization was facing when it was being founded. The rising action and challenges and potential solution, those could be the challenges that the individual faces with this current status quo, maybe before they found your organization. What were some of the things that they came up against? What did they try? What maybe worked for a moment and then didn't work? What didn't work at all? And then the climax, the turning point, what is that moment? What was that moment that brought in your organization, that connected your organization to the individual, right? And then what was that moment that really shifted things? And then the resolution, or how they got engaged in your work in the first place, right? And then the last piece is, what were the outcomes of that individual working with your organization, being supported through your organization, or what were the outcomes of the organization being founded, if that's the story that you're using, okay? If you're like, okay, Mallory, this is a lot, you're giving me a lot of things at once, don't worry, we're going to walk step by step. And I'm going to ask you a few questions under each of these pillars to help you really start to generate and create your story. Okay, I'm so glad that we have a little bit of a smaller group today, and I'll leave time for questions at the end as well. So we'll use this really as an opportunity to like walk you through and be able to leave here having some idea of your magnetic impact story. So this next slide, if you're seeing this slide and you've come to my webinars a lot, or you hear me speak a lot, you're probably like, oh my God, Mallory, you talk about this all the time. You are totally right. And I'm never going to stop, because the reality is that if we are talking about, so you need to have awareness around the internal stories you are telling yourself about your organization, about yourself, about the work that you're doing, before you're going to be able to write an impactful and magnetic story externally. Okay. If we want people to connect with us out there, we need to get our stories right in here. And we tell ourselves a lot of stories and a lot of narratives that hold us back. And they actually hold us back from telling our most magnetic stories. They hold us back from really, truly being able to connect with the people that want to connect with us. Okay. So if you are new to my work, then welcome to the cognitive behavior loop, because this is really the basis of everything that I talk about, which is that the idea behind our beliefs and our thoughts inform how we feel, and then ultimately the actions that we take and the energy that we bring to those actions, okay? The energy that we bring to those actions. I just had a really interesting experience recently where somebody was saying, okay, so you just want to help fundraisers be able to send more emails to donors. And I said, well, not exactly, because I want to help fundraisers send the right emails to donors, and the right emails to donors depend on the energy behind how they write those emails, what's happening inside their brain when they write those emails, how they feel in their body when they click send on those emails. Because if we're clicking send on an email with like one eye open and we're like not totally sure that we want to say what we're saying, but we're kind of saying it anyway, that's likely not the email we actually want to be sending that donor. And so the cognitive behavior loop, the thoughts and the beliefs that you're holding about yourself, about your organization, about your organization's founding story, about the impact of your work, about the beneficiaries of your services, you want to make sure that those are lined up, those are in alignment with the way that you want to show up as a storyteller. Okay. And I'm going to give you an example of this from fundraising. Okay. In particular, right? I talk about when I started to really look at my own cognitive behavior loop, what were some of the thoughts and the beliefs that I was holding that were leading to how I felt about fundraising, and then ultimately how I showed up as a fundraiser. One of the underlying beliefs was that I was begging people for money, that I was asking people to give me something they didn't really want to give me, but I was going to ask them in just the right way that maybe they'd do me a favor and give me some of their money because we really needed money and they had some money. And that's what I thought that fundraising was. So how did I show up as a fundraiser when those were my underlying thoughts and beliefs? Not that well, right? And so when I started to ask myself, okay, but what is good fundraising really about? And maybe for you, it's what is good storytelling really about? Or what is good marketing really about? For me, my big takeaway here is that good fundraising is not an ask, it's an offer. It's about inviting people in. It's about giving people an opportunity to participate in something meaningful, to make change in the community that they want to make. It's about connecting people and creating networks and movements. And when fundraising is done really well, that's what it is, an incredible offer, an incredible opportunity. And when I started to internalize those beliefs and those thoughts, you better believe I totally felt different as a fundraiser. And I also started to show up completely differently as a fundraiser. So if you feel resistance to writing stories, telling stories, doing certain marketing, this is something you want to start to look at. What are some of the underlying thoughts and beliefs that I might be holding about storytelling or about marketing or about fundraising or about me? And start to look at those, start to challenge those, because this is where the work starts. And everything I'm about to talk to, all the logistics of the dramatic arc, all of those things, your ability to do all of those things depends on this. Okay. All right. Take a quick sip of water, and then we're going to dive into the logistics of writing your magnetic impact story. Okay. So before you write your specific story, because like I said, you can use this framework for lots of different types of storytelling. Okay. So before you write your story, you need to identify a few really critical things, because these determine how you write those 5 other pillars. Okay. What is the story about? Is it about a person, a beneficiary, the organization's founding story, the campaign? You need to identify that first, and you need to pick one thing. Okay. When we smush, you'll see in these 5 pillars, when we try to smush this all together, oh, I'm gonna do all of this in one story. It doesn't work. It breaks. So you have to pick one thing. Okay. One thing. You also need to identify who is my audience. Okay. One audience. Okay. Who are you writing this to? Now, this doesn't mean that this great story that you're going to tell ultimately shouldn't be told to multiple audiences, but you will see in these pillars how the story will need to be shifted slightly by audience. Okay. So before you write your story that we're talking about today, you need to identify one audience too. Okay. And then the next piece is, what emotion do you want the audience to feel? Right? There's that great quote, like, people won't remember what we said, but they'll remember how we made them feel, right? Nothing could be more true than that. Okay. And that's the thing about storytelling. That's the thing about magnetism. Magnetism has nothing to do with the words that are coming out of my mouth, it has everything to do with how I'm making you feel. Okay. So what emotion do you want the audience to feel when they hear your story? And I use the term audience, but it might be as they're reading your email or looking at something on social media. Okay. But how do you want the people absorbing this story to feel? And then what's the purpose of the story? And this is a place to really be aware of the cognitive behavior loop. You need to be honest about this. Is the purpose of the story to get people to sign a petition? Is the purpose of the story to help you raise money? And money is not a bad word. Is the purpose of the story to build an ambassador program for your organization? Is the purpose of the story to inspire people to volunteer more? You need to be really, really honest of this, because again, magnetic storytelling is about alignment of these pieces. So another thing that breaks storytelling a lot of the time is when we say, oh, it's just, we want people to become more aware of our mission. But your real purpose is that this is a part of a fundraising campaign and you're trying to raise money. And when we're not honest about those things, it breaks this process too. So be really honest. What is the purpose of telling this story? What do you truly want from that? Okay, I love this quote, and people are also probably super tired of hearing it, but I don't care. Which this quote had such a huge impact on my fundraising. Okay, the Seth Godin quote, people like us do things like this. okay? The impact story content pillars that we're going to be talking through right now, all of them come back to this, to helping people identify, do people like me do things like this? Am I in the right place? Are people like me here? Do people like me take actions like this? Okay. You're going to see how every single one of these pillars comes back to this. Okay. All right. Yes. Oh my gosh. I love everything Seth Godin. Okay. Getting him on what the fundraising was like, I was like, should I retire? Like, I'm not sure that I can go anywhere else from here. And every day after he booked the session, I would wake up and open my phone and be like, tell my husband that, oh my gosh, it's still on my calendar, you guys. I can't believe it. It's still on my calendar. So yeah, and that he has been instrumental in shifting how I think about fundraising. Okay. All right, so we are back to the impact story pillars. So again, we're going to walk through each one of these right now: exposition and character development, conflict and core problem, rising action, challenges, potential solutions, getting to that climax, and then resolution. Here's one of the things I want to remind you of. So stories create, like I said at the beginning, context, and they help us relate to each other, okay? They are so much more memorable and build so much more familiarity and trust than data or numbers, okay? Stories lead to belonging, okay? They create emotions that connect us, and then the emotions ultimately motivate charitable action, okay? And so this is what creates a longer term connection as well. If you know anything about me, you know that I'm not interested in helping you get some one-time donation and then the donor doesn't come back. So the storytelling is really about building that relationship, that long-term relationship. And maybe your purpose of your story that time is to get them to give, to participate in a campaign, but it's not just to get them to give that one time and then drop off. That's why we're not going to be using any fake urgency or cringy tactics when we talk about our storytelling, because we want them to give. And we want them to be excited about their involvement in your organization, not doing some favor or guilt gift, okay? So we're going to talk about that. Oftentimes, one of the things that falls short here is that people build belonging just in one of those 5 pillars. So as we move through these 5 pillars, I really want you to keep this in mind. We want to be building belonging and context and relationship through all of the pillars, okay? One of the things I see organizations do a lot of the time is they sort of acknowledge the audience that they're talking to, maybe just in the character development at the very beginning, or maybe just in the core problem. And then they really lose sight of the relatability of the story through all the other pillars. So I want you to keep this in mind as we start to move through these pillars. And, I wasn't going to do this, Celine, but just because it is a small group, I'm just going to pause for a second before we walk through these 5 and see if anyone has any questions about what I've covered so far. No? Are people good? You can tell me in the chat. Keep going. Don't stop if you have no questions. But I just wanted to give people an opportunity to ask them since we're here together live. Okay, I'll keep an eye on the chat and I can stop after I keep going if you guys have them, okay?
Thanks,
hopefully
Mallory.
you're with me. Okay. Okay, so I want to give you an example of an organization, not just my own story, okay, but an example of an organization using these pillars, okay? So I have a friend who has a little one with a severe peanut allergy, and so I created this fake organization based on, loosely based on their story, okay? Just to give you an idea, okay? So I'm gonna say this story to you. I'm gonna actually as if I was delivering this story, okay? So our founder, Susan, was 30 when she had her first son, Josh, and she had dreamed of, being that mother that did all of these amazing adventures with her son. Her and her husband used to travel so much before. And so they were so excited to travel once Josh came around. And at the beginning, Josh was just like any normal 6-month-old. Like he loved eating his mushed peas and he loved those little weird spinning chairs, but they were so soaking in this incredible new parenthood journey. And then one day, Susan was playing with Josh in the bath, and all of a sudden she noticed these hives appearing on his back and then all of a sudden on his stomach. And before she knew it, she started to WebMD, what this might be. She was home alone. Her husband was out at a happy hour. And then she started to get really freaked out that he was going into anaphylactic shock. And so luckily she threw him in the car, she got him to the hospital in time to get that EpiPen shot, and he was okay. And she had this moment sitting there in the hospital watching him like hooked up to the Benadryl IV. And she was so relieved, right, that he was going to be okay, and that she had seen it when she had seen it, and that she had been home when that had happened for the first time. But it was confirmed right after that he had a severe peanut allergy. And so, Susan is like one of those moms that just like has it all together and has done all the research, read all the baby books. So being the researcher type that she is, she started to look through every single type of solution that she could find to support Josh in his peanut allergy. She bought EpiPens galore. They put them everywhere in all the diaper bags all around their house. They brought their own food everywhere they went. They would send messages everywhere before they would go anywhere. And she thought she had it under control, right? She controlled this entire situation. And then all of a sudden, one day it happened again. And she didn't know how peanuts had gotten into what Josh had eaten, but she was laying there in the hospital bed with him. And she started to think about the fact that there was no way she could fully make Josh safe and support him if she wasn't able to train the other caregivers in his life around a peanut allergy. And so she started to look at what resources might exist to train schools and train other youth leaders around peanut allergies. And there really wasn't anything in her area. And that's what inspired her to start Josh's Shot. And Josh's Shot goes into schools around the country, trains nurses, trains teaching staff to be able to identify and address allergies that are happening in the classroom. And the result of the founding of this organization has been amazing. The support of people like you have saved so many young people's lives in schools, and saved so many parents the constant daily stress of sending their kids off somewhere that doesn't know how to accommodate their needs. So we're so grateful for your support of Josh's Shot curriculum that has allowed blah, blah, blah. Okay, whatever. I'm making this all up on the spot based on what's below. But what I want you to see, right, is how that story unfolds, right? I told you things about Susan. I told you details about Susan, her hopes and dreams of having a kid. I gave so many opportunities for you to connect with Susan. Maybe you didn't connect with her on the traveling with the kid thing, but maybe you've had a scary experience with someone where you noticed a health thing and had to address it, or maybe you were alone. Maybe we've all had that WebMD moment, right? Where we've been scouring the internet for that, and then trying to find different solutions that are out there, solving things for ourselves, and then thinking we had it under control, and then being surprised again, or having something happen that was outside of our control, right? So there are so many elements at every single pillar. I was giving you an opportunity to connect with Susan's experience, whether or not you have a kid, whether or not you have a peanut allergy, whether or not, right, you could still connect with her and this story in different ways. So that's what the storytelling arc does when it's really built on relationships and being relational.
And Mallory, we have a question from Janine in the chat.
Yes.
So Janine asks, can you break down how we can use these pillars in a social post, for example? And I know here at Memory Fox, video is key, but would love some examples of what you'd suggest there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I want to encourage you of is, if you're developing some of these stories for the first time, you might go big in terms of the amount of language that you're using to tell the story, right? The story that I just told you had a lot of content in it. But stories can also be told in really, really, really quick ways, right? And you can use social posts to maybe take one of the big relational pieces and lead with that. So maybe you take, you're taking the core problem, for example, and you really want to help people become more problem aware around the core problem, but you want to leverage it in a way where, or you want to use it in a way where you're also highlighting a relational aspect of this. So I wrote about this in one of my posts on Instagram. Let's say you're an environmental organization, and you want to say something like, maybe your audience is a lot of, I think in the post I put new moms. Okay. And so you can say something like, I know that what keeps a lot of us up at night is the world that the next generation or our young kids are going to inherit. And one of the things that we've realized here is that the underlying issue that stops us from being able to do X is blank. And we know that people like you want to make a difference in X, right? So that's like a very quick way of showing it. Or maybe you are telling a story, like you want to tell Susan's story in a piece on social media, and you start the social post by saying something like, who's ever gone down a WebMD rabbit hole? Did you know that that was one of the founding moments that inspired Susan to start Josh's Shot? Because after he was in the hospital for the second time when he was exposed to peanuts unknowingly, it sent her down this research rabbit hole. And like we all know from WebMD, sometimes helpful, but oftentimes continues the stressed out spiral. And so that's why we need resources like Josh's Shot to save other families and people from having to rely on ambiguous online medical information. Okay. So that's just like an example of how you would take a piece of this story and put it into, like Natalie said, like a hook, give a hook at the beginning based on one relational aspect, and then convert that into a social post. So I hope that's helpful. Okay. All right, so let's walk through the pillars, and I'm going to give you questions under each of the pillars to help you like draw this out if you're not exactly sure where to start. Okay, so pillar number 1 is the exposition or the character development. So you've already identified who your audience is for this storytelling. So who does your audience want to support? Sometimes that's going to be students, sometimes, or Susan, sometimes that's going to be other young people like Josh, but who does your audience want to support? And that's how you focus on which character you want to develop or you want to focus on in your story. And then once you've identified the character that you're focusing on in your story, what context in the character's life is most relatable and relevant to this audience? So relevance creates urgency. I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more later, but I was never really talked to about this from a fundraising perspective. I learned this once I started to do a lot more marketing research and learning, but urgency, like we don't like that cringy urgency that feels fake, right? Like nobody wants to send those emails. Nobody wants to get those emails. So how do you create actual urgency? One of the ways to do that is through relevance. Why is this relevant to this person right now? So in this part, in this pillar, we're focused on why is this relevant to this person? Okay, so what is the most relatable and relevant element of this? So let's say I was talking about Josh's Shot to a room of new mothers, right? I probably would have spent a lot more time developing the story around her first 6 months of motherhood. Maybe I'd even show pictures of those early months of motherhood, right? She loved those first few week cuddles in that baby bubble bliss, or whatever it is. You're expanding on the piece that relates directly to the audience. So what's the context? What's the relatable and relevant context that relates to the audience you identified? So these are 2 questions to get you thinking about pillar number 1, okay? And then pillar number 2, what keeps this audience up at night? What are their worries? What are their desires? How are they viewing the problems in the world as they relate to the organization that your work does? So that's where you saw pieces around this. This even relates to some of the pieces around like WebMD, right? But also some of the core problems are for new moms. If I was talking to new moms about Josh's Shot, are all the unknowns of having kids, or the fear of one day seeing something that's scary and you don't know what to do, right? The core problem is, again, about the core problem through the viewing of that problem from the audience's perspective and how that relates to the work that you're doing. Okay, so what are some of the underlying fears that keep this audience up at night related to the work that you do? Okay, so that's pillar number 2. Pillar number 3, this is where we start to go into the rising action. Okay. These are conflicts and challenges, sometimes potential solutions, right? So when I was telling my own story, right, I said I switched organizations, and actually at first it did feel better. So that was an example of a rising action. I tried to solve a potential solution, but then ultimately, again, I was in the same position again. So think about, again, through the perspective of this audience, what types of challenges will grab their attention and what types of solutions might grab their attention too, right? And what creates some of that tension for them. We don't want to create too much overwhelm. We don't want to be manipulating them, but remember that piece around cortisol, right? So we want to create some tension. That's the WebMD, like definitely right there, right? Is trying to solve a problem on our own without sufficient information. What types of challenges will grab their attention related to the work that you do? And how does some of it create some tension in their experience of learning about the story? Like, oh, I hate that too. Or, oh, that always stresses me out when that happens. Or, yeah, that drives me crazy, right? That's what you're sort of doing in the rising conflict and challenges. And if you're doing potential solutions, maybe there's this moment of like, oh yeah, I would have tried that too. Like that was good thinking. Oh, but it makes sense it didn't work because of this, right? So you're sort of bringing them along on that journey. That's what's happening during this rising action section. Okay, and then pillar number 4 is the climax or the turning point. So how does your organization enter the scene? So if this is with somebody that you work with in particular, what happened? They tried all these other things. It didn't work. It didn't work. They got to this moment. Your organization entered the scene. How did that happen? How did your organization enter the scene? And why is your organization the solution to create this turning point in the story? So they had tried all these other things, or they've been up against all these other hurdles, and then blank, right? Or then Susan founded Josh's Shot, right? She couldn't find other solutions out there. She couldn't find anyone that was training, in-school nurses and classroom teachers. And so enter Josh's Shot, right? Why was that necessary? Why was that needed? Why did that enter right then and there? Okay, so that is pillar number 4, that climax, that turning point. And then pillar number 5 is the resolution. So this is also really critical that your audience is with you this whole time. Remember how I said that piece before, that one of the ways we lose people in our storytelling is if we only include them at the beginning of the story as the audience, and then it becomes all about us and all about our organization at the end, right? So what makes them feel a part of the solution? And even if you're maybe doing this for a fundraising campaign and they haven't given yet to your organization, that's okay, right? I just did an incredible podcast episode with a behavioral scientist who gave some really new groundbreaking research on when fundraising campaigns or marketing campaigns used really specific information about the people who had already given to a campaign, it boosted donations. So for example, the study was done in Sweden at a university, and they tested emails that went out that said 73% of Swedish students have already supported blank. Okay, that definitely increased donations a little bit. But what really increased donations was when they said 73% of Swedish students at blank university have already done X. That had a huge impact on people giving. So when you're doing the resolution, you want to make sure that the audience, is being seen in that. What makes them feel, people like us do things like this, what makes them feel a part of the solution. And again, this is what creates a sense of real urgency, not cringy clickbaity urgency, but relevance. Why now? Okay, because the resolution is designed to relieve tension in one of 2 ways. Okay, the cortisol has been released, right? They're focused, they're identifying with the character in the story, they've identified with the core problem, the rising action. So here they are, they have a little bit of cortisol, and we want to relieve the tension that they're experiencing from that cortisol. There are 2 ways to do that. One is to share impact. If they've already given to your organization, and this email, the purpose, that's why purpose is so important. The purpose of this email is to build a deeper relationship with them, get them excited about the giving that they've already done, all of those things. Then you're going to relieve that tension by sharing impact. How was their donation used? Or what did the organization do recently thanks to blank, right? Some of the storytelling example I did with Susan. But if you want them to give, then the resolution is actually getting them involved. It's the call to action. It's the invitation, the opportunity for them to address the issue that you've been talking about through this whole story. And either of these things, this is what releases the oxytocin, right? So making sure, again, that in the ask, in the invitation, you are continuing to build real urgency, community, belonging, identity. We don't want to lose all the beautiful pieces of your magnetic storytelling the moment you get to the call to action. Okay. That's why just like a donate button at the end of a beautiful story is actually not even a call to action related to that story, because it's so disconnected. It's not actually a resolution to the tension that you've built through the story. And it doesn't relate directly to the audience, just like these other pillars. So that's why it's so important to be thinking about those fundamental principles as they relate to all 5 of these pillars. Okay. I want to make sure I'm leaving time for questions at the end. So I'm going to keep going. Okay. I want to remind you, actually, I'm going to take a sip of water while I have this big thing on the screen. So these are the 5 pillars and how we worked through all of them. Okay. And you will have these questions and things like that. So you can go back, you can develop this out with your team, maybe with your board. But I want to say something really important before we move on to questions. And I'm going to do a quick recap too. Will 100% of people resonate with your impact story? Sorry, there's a typo in there. Absolutely not. The purpose of a good impact story is not about 100% of people aligning with it. It's about the right people being able to align with it. So the more specific that you are, the more specific about your connection points, about your relevance, those things are going to help you find the right people. Okay. When it comes to storytelling, I think you have the opportunity to have like a little like lantern or a razor. What are they called? Radar. What are the things you wave in cats' faces? I don't have a cat. Laser. It's been a long morning already. Laser, right? So you can have your like lantern, which you think is going to light up more things, but actually what a lantern does is it just diffuses the light. And not everyone, like imagine if 2 people are standing in a field and one of them's holding a lantern and the other is pointing a laser. How do you know who to go to, right? You're not sure. Is that lantern for me? Are you calling me? Do you need me? Or like, are you just lighting your way home, right? Somebody's pointing a laser straight at you. You know, this is for me. This is for me. They're asking me to come over there. They keep waving it in my face. That's what good storytelling does. Good storytelling that narrows on audience and relevance and all those things. It helps you point that laser lovingly at the right people who are aligned with you and who want to engage with that story. Okay, so nope, not that. Here's the quick recap of what we talked about today. So storytelling that follows the dramatic arc releases chemicals in the brain that inspire people to invest in your organization. That's the cortisol, oxytocin. The stories that you tell yourself about your organization matter. So you need to be conscious of the way that the cognitive behavior loop is impacting your storytelling. Your impact story is critical to engage all types of supporters, because this is what builds belonging with the organization when there is alignment across those 2 to 5 of the content pillars. And the more you can do, the better. And then understanding that segmenting your audience is critical to make sure you're aligning the right story with the right audience. So like I said at the very beginning, you're going to build this beautiful story. It doesn't mean that not everybody should get to hear this story. But when you send that story out in whatever channels you send it out in, you want to make sure that the audience you've identified in building that story is the audience that you're sending it to. And then you adjust it appropriately for other audiences. Okay. I just had an experience recently, and I'm sure this happens to you guys all the time. I had an experience recently where there was a company who sells a product to nonprofits. And they clearly didn't look very closely at my website because they put me into a category as being a nonprofit. Now, they actually have a product that brings consultants and nonprofits together. Like there could have been a pitch for me to actually get on a call with this company. But because they sent me an email as if I was a nonprofit, I was like, they don't see me. I'm not here. I'm not in this email. This was meant for someone else. And so that's what happens when we send an email to a different audience, to somebody who isn't in that group, who doesn't feel seen or included or like they belong. And so that's why segmentation of your stories and your channels and things like that can be so helpful. And if you're wondering on social media, you're like, wait, Mallory, we have lots of stories on social media. So call out some of the audience at the beginning of your post. This one goes out to all the blank, right? Like identify the audience at the beginning instead of saying everybody here should resonate with blank. Right? So you can tailor your audience, even when you're in a platform that has multiple audiences like that, you can still tailor your messaging and identify that audience in the beginning as part of a hook. Okay, before we go on to questions, if you liked what you learned here, if you're interested in learning more about Power Partners, you can take my free masterclass. It's at malloryerickson.com/free, where I go through my entire framework. It's all right there for you. I'll throw this in the chat as well. These are other ways to connect with me. Instagram. I'm starting to hang out more on LinkedIn too. Thanks to Natalie. We can give Natalie Monroe a big shout out for that over at Memory Fox. She's been a huge part of helping me learn that platform and make that transition to that platform. And then I also have a free community, whatthefundraisingcommunity.com. Started a few months ago, and we already have over 600 fundraisers inside of there, helping each other out, really rooted in a lot of the principles that we talked about today, sharing resources and all of those things. So yes, she is. Natalie Monroe is the LinkedIn whisperer. I love that. So thank you for having me today. Now we can leave the last 10 minutes for questions. I'll throw the links to these resources in the chat, but I can stop sharing my screen if you want, just so we can come on and anyone can ask questions. How does that sound? Okay.
It sounds
amazing.
Great.
So you can ask me anything. You can ask me specific questions. Did some come in?
Yeah, we just have one that came in. How many different impact stories do you recommend we develop?
Ooh. So, this is a really good question. This is not a one size fits all answer, what I'm going to say right now, because I think part of this depends a little bit on the structure of your organization and how many programs you have, for example. And so I would probably have at least one more robust story per program that you have. I would have a story for the founding of your organization. I would have your personal story, right? You can use this arc in a very short span to say why you started working at the organization, right? I had just blank. It bothered me every day that there was blank, and I was constantly worried about it. At first I tried to get involved with blank, and then I tried to do blank, but none of those things really felt like they were addressing X. So then I joined X organization, which I loved because it did X, Y, and Z. And since then I've seen XXX, right? So that was quick, right? And it just that's your little kind of personal story, personal elevator pitch. So you want to have that too. And then what I'll say is you build your big impact story per program area. And then, like I said before, break that story into a million pieces to share multi-channel, use Memory Fox to get ask some questions related to this arc, right? Get some folks answering some of the questions maybe in relationship to this arc. And then you have huge content pillars built around the storytelling arc for each of your programs.
So that answers a follow-up question from Nicole, Mallory. And Nicole, feel free to come off mute if you want to expand on this. Developing different impact stories for each program. So you do think that that's critical and being thoughtful of that?
I mean, I think it's a good thing to have. Now, but part of this depends on your fundraising strategy, right? So inside Power Partners, what I really teach is around aligning. We don't look for restricted funding, but we look for aligning a donor with the area of the organization that they're particularly passionate about and sharing stories that relate to that point of alignment. So not every organization will necessarily feel like they need a different impact story for each program. But if you are attracting a lot of donors who are particularly interested, for example, in like your 7th grade math program, then I would have a story about your 7th grade math program that you have on hand and that you're building content around, because it seems like that is already like an audience interest area, right? So that's a little bit around like identifying an audience, identifying an interest area, and then building a story that hooks and brings those folks in.
And we have another question, Mallory, from Sarah.
Yes.
Would you recommend segmenting by funds that donors have previously given to? We're working on building out our donor demographic info.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I would be careful. This is where the cognitive behavior loop is really important, because I would be careful not to like leave those donors out of other asks or other campaigns. Like I would not want you to say, because they gave to X program, that's all that they're interested in. But you have some great data to say that they are particularly aligned with that interest area. So they probably would be excited to see content and stories that are related to that area of the organization, right? So this is like a both and situation. We don't want to leave them out of inviting them to participate in other things. And you also want to pay attention to then, depending on how you track your like donor data as it's coming in, you know, if they came in, for example, from a peer-to-peer campaign that was related to a particular donor area or a particular program area, I wouldn't say that you know yet that that actually is the program alignment area for that individual, because their alignment was with their friend or their family member who engaged them in the organization. So I think that's another thing you want to be careful of. Like sometimes when I get emails, when I gave to a friend's walk or run or something like that, and then I get an email from an organization that's like, for being a trusted support, like longtime supporter of our organization. And I'm like, what organization is this? Like, what did I, like, when did I give to them? And it's like, and then I go Google it because I'm like so confused and I'm worried they sent this to the wrong person. And I'm like, oh, I gave to Lorraine's bike ride that was through this organization. I hadn't even realized that. So this is why it's so important to sort of like identify also like how people are moving into your organization.
And Mallory, I think that just brings up such a beautiful point of being thoughtful about segmenting your audiences, but also using story to engage them and to keep them engaged in your mission and in your community. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that everyone can see here. We'd love to hear from you. So take out your phones, give us your feedback and let us know, do you have any feedback, questions, or topics for the future? But we love bringing experts from the nonprofit community and marketing, fundraising, and all of the above to you, our community. And thank you, Mallory, for being so generous with your time today and helping us tell better stories and be magnetic.
Thank you for having me. And thank you guys so much. If you have, when you dive into your stories, if you have additional questions, pop them in the What the Fundraising community. I can answer them there. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Memory Fox, for making it easier for nonprofits to tell stories and share stories and do so in authentic and transparent and organic ways. It makes such a difference. And so that's the other thing I'll say. This was not about this for everybody listening, but like, this is not all about writing, right? Of course, you're on a Memory Fox webinar. Like these stories, like the magnetism, the connection, all of those things, apply these to all of your different ways of engaging with people, like using Memory Fox. So thank you.
So thank you again. And thank you all again. And as we like to say, keep telling great stories. Have a lovely week, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks, everybody.